To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is focus on human rights on the eve of the 60th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. Joining us this evening on the show are Dr. Pakisud Saranamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Hijaz Hizbullah, Attorney at Law, Lasanthika Hettiarachchi, Interim Senior Manager, Advocacy and Research, Transparency International Sri Lanka, as well as Dr. Jehan Pereira, Executive Director of the National Peace Council. I now move my attention towards Lasanthika Hettiarachchi, Interim Senior Manager, Advocacy and Research at Transparency International Sri Lanka. Lasanthika, now something very interesting happened at the 60th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions. I want to talk a little bit about Gaza as well, because we are here today and we have to look at exactly what went wrong in this crisis also. I feel, I may be wrong, correct me if I am, even the Human Rights Council sessions, which is supposed to look at overall human rights violations across the world, it seems to be cherry picking on what they want to talk about. Look at this previous sessions, they are not talking about the atrocities that is being committed in Gaza. They have recognized, 143 member states have recognized Palestine as an independent state by the United Nations, but their rights are never discussed, never spoken of. Why little Sri Lanka?
Shamir, answering your question, I don't think myself, I or anyone here can actually answer as to why Sri Lanka and not Gaza in the first place. But in terms of the fact that Gaza sort of gets sidestepped and is not in the forefront of the discussion in this Human Rights Council, I think again speaks to the accountability that we are all talking about here, because one thing that we all seem to sometimes forget is that the very institutions that are set up to hold maybe the states accountable and within the governments to hold the governments accountable, the public sector accountable, there seem to be a sort of overlooking on those specific institutions. It might be the UN, it might be the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka, it might be the law enforcement. When it comes to human rights, and speaking within my scope and expertise in anti-corruption, accountability, almost we always forget to look at those institutions that are set up to actually make sure that with a state is accountable. Member states when it comes to the UN, and the state agencies when it comes to a single country. So, like you very correctly said, they do not talk about Gaza at all, or not enough at all. So that's, I think, again going back to the actual accountability issue.
Right. So if you look at, Lasanthika, if you look at the anti-corruption front, now this government seems to be riding on that wave.
Yeah.
Every morning someone is arrested and behind bars. A very strong politician who was in the previous government, they seem to be doing all what is right in terms of making sure that there is accountability in terms of the corruption that has taken place in the country. But when it comes to human rights, they're not doing anything substantial, because if you look at it, human rights starts from the late 1980s. It starts from the 83 riots. It starts from 89, what happened in Sri Lanka. It starts from the 3-decade-long war. We had to talk about what happened during the Aragal era. All these things are human rights that is plaguing the nation. But this government seems to be riding on that anti-corruption wave quite well, because even if you look at the statement that was made by Vijay Therath, he went on to say that they are now hell-bent moving towards that anti-corruption slogan and the mandate that they have been given.
Correct, Shamir. I think what needs to happen is that the government needs to start looking at it's all good and well that they are on this anti-corruption rhetoric and, you know, being hell-bent on making sure that we are free of corruption. But the problem is that they're looking at anti-corruption in isolation, right? You can never look at whether it's human rights or corruption. Those are not things you can take in isolation and look at. For example, anti-corruption itself disproportionately affects different communities. Anti-corruption disproportionately affects the youth. It disproportionately affects the women and the minority communities, right? So you can't forget human rights just because you're looking at anti-corruption. That's not going to work because they are always interconnected, right? Whenever there is no aspect of our lives or governance where anti-corruption doesn't, where corruption doesn't creep in, and then one consequence of that is human rights violations, and there's always abuse of power in every human rights violation. So it's actually what the government needs to do is, it's good you look at anti-corruption, but you must also look at it from these interconnected perspectives of human rights, the gender. They are all always interconnected. So you can't take anti-corruption in isolation. That's like, I think the previous governments, what they kept saying, you know, let us look at the economy first. We'll forget the rights for now. We need to bring the economy first. That is not how economy and human development and economic development works. So, like you said, there is not enough attention to human rights. They can very well bring human rights into their anti-corruption narratives, like, for example, PTA, right? Like Hijaz very correctly said, if they're going to replace PTA with something else, they have to make sure that it's looked at from a human rights angle. The CSO consultations, public consultations are done. So I think that's where they need to sort of redirect themselves in the anti-corruption narrative.
Let me ask Lasanthika, now you represent TISL, Transparency International Sri Lanka, which is part of the global Transparency International. Now, we see over the last few years this weakening of such of institutions around the world, but we see the institutions such as yours, which are standing strong and pretty much fighting back and trying to maintain some kind of sanity to the world order. How do you feel about these other institutions, these organizations like the UN, which are pretty much going to pieces?
I think, Nilesh, there's a big difference between Transparency International, structure-wise, you know. This is just civil society, and we're talking about the UN, which is member states. So there's huge, because we don't have that politics within Transparency International global movement, because each country have their own chapters. It's a very different structure. So I don't think it's fair to even compare, because there are other civil society organizations who are also present in many countries, like Transparency International, who have been working just fine and without any of the, you know, geopolitics within their organizations. So I think that's just two different things on why this is this way and why the UN is the way that we are all talking about right now. But I think it goes back to, again, other than the, you know, powerhouses within the Security Council, I think it's just speaking from anti-corruption, you know, transparency point of view. It's just the fact that those agencies themselves, maybe, you know, there is a need to look at themselves. Into even the UN, they're talking about transparency, accountability, and, you know, telling all these countries on, you know, how to be more transparent, accountable, you know, protecting human rights and anti-corruption. But I think because Shamir also mentioned the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka, there is, I think it's a time for these organizations also to look at themselves and see whether within that organization, whether you're actually living up to what you're preaching and what you're telling the member states to do. Because that's what, because you asked, Transparency International, we try our level best to make sure internally our organizations are not prone to any criticism, right, from every single person who is working there. That's not negotiable. We can't have any vulnerability, corruption vulnerability within our organizations if we are going to go and tell our governments on how to do good governance and how to be accountable and transparent. So I think that is the structure that we would like to see even in, memberships like the UN, be accountable to their own organizations, and that also translates to domestic organizations.
Very quickly, Lasanthika, just for us to understand. Now we know the biggest funder for the UN before Trump was the United States.
Yeah.
If I ask you, who is funding Transparency International globally?
Globally, so we've had US funding, which is now cut down quite a bit. We've been funded by the Commonwealth, the Australian.
So don't you
it's
think
multiple governments and institutions.
Yeah, but don't you think invariably that allows you to hold a candle to governments like the US when it comes to matters of human rights and even anti-corruption?
We do, Shamir. Transparency International US, United States, they are trying their best. On the US side,
but do you all have that pressure? That's what I asked Dr. Jehan as well. When you are being funded by a foreign government, and can you go against that government, being a civil rights movement or an organization? I find it a little bit difficult to stomach, but you could probably respond to that.
Yes. Speaking of, we are a global organization with over 100 countries. We are present in over 100 countries. But speaking of our own country, our own chapter, I can tell you with 100% certainty we can. Just because we are being funded by a particular organization, or we even work with the government. We work together with the CIABOC. We are in the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan Steering Committee. We go and sit with the government, states, and the CIABOC. That does not mean we don't criticize the CIABOC when we must. If there is accountability or transparency issue, that we won't do our job and go against these institutions just because we are sitting with them in one steering committee. That's not how it has to work.
Lasanthika, now in your initial remarks you said about corruption and human rights violation go hand in glove, right? Now this has been continuing for a long time in Sri Lanka. Are we missing something in the judiciary? Because we always criticize our rule of law, right? We have the laws, but we don't implement it. How do you see that?
I think, Shihar, that is starting from the law enforcement, the police itself. Implementing the laws has always been an issue in this country, and that's not only up to the judiciary. Implementation happens by the government and then the law enforcement. But not to say that there are no, issues within the judicial system. Look at how we make the laws in the first place, right? We are talking about implementation, but before implementation, OSA, PTA, how do we make our laws? That itself does not take into account that intersection between human rights, anti-corruption, public participation, open governance. Right? Our lawmaking process itself, before it goes into implementation, we need to fix the law-making process. Most likely we will see this happen again, like Hijaz said, when the new PTA comes, whatever that is going to replace a PTA. Just giving 2 weeks to people, putting it on a website and saying give your feedback is not meaningful public participation. That's not. A government should not be able to just put it on a website, give 2 weeks and say, oh, we did civil society consultations, we consulted the public. That's not meaningful public participation. So our system needs to start first from the law making itself, and implementation is a completely, you know, is
Dr.
another.
Sara,
Move to Lasanthika Hettiarachchi, Interim Senior Manager, Advocacy and Research, Transparency International Sri Lanka.
My thought is, Shamir, that since, you know, I'm coming from the anti-corruption background, what the government need to do is to realize and start working in the direction that anti-corruption is not a technical issue. It's a human issue. That connection is missing. They are looking at anti-corruption in isolation, and that is why human rights, they're not connecting human rights with anti-corruption. So, because it's looked at as this sort of cross-cutting structural technical issue, instead of understanding that it's threat to the structure, which then in turn violates the human rights. So I think the anti-corruption, their strong anti-corruption narrative is good. I mean, not that it doesn't have its weaknesses, but in the context of human rights, the government needs to start looking at anti-corruption as a human issue, and then they will see the gaps in the anti-corruption agenda where that is violating human rights.
Thank you very much, Lasanthika.